Hi everyone, in today's video we're going to be looking at obedience to authority, which is Milgram. In this video I won't go through any of the variations, this will just be his main research study. Milgram conducted his study in 1963 and he wanted to find out whether ordinary Americans would obey an unjust order from a person in authority to inflict pain on another person, and to discover what factors in a situation led people to obey. Then we have the procedure, which is quite long. You do not need to know all of it. It's just good knowledge to build in your answers, but I wouldn't say that it's as necessary as the results. So in the procedure, we have 40 males aged between 20 and 50. And they were introduced to another participant who was a Confederate. And a Confederate is someone that pretends to be a participant but is actually working with the experimenter and told what answers to give, how to behave, etc. The experimenter wore a white lab coat to reinforce status and authority. And the participants were told they were taking part in a memory and learning experiment, which is not true. So they were deceived. One key thing that I would recommend when revising social influence is to always keep ethical issues at the forefront of your mind, because when it comes to evaluations, it is really, really useful to integrate ethical issues, and you can get questions based on ethical issues. The experiment was rigged, so the Confederate always ended up as the learner and the participant the teacher. And the learner mentioned that he had a heart complaint, which comes in later on when we look at the method. The original experiment took place in a lab at Yale, and the learner was in a different room to the teacher. After the learner learned the list of word pairs that he was given, the teacher tests him by naming a word and asking the learner to reply with its partner. Every time he got a word wrong, the teacher was told to administer an electric shock, increasing the level each time. And there were 30 switches from 15 volts to 450. And the learner purposefully gave mainly wrong answers. At 180 volts, the learner shouted that he could not bear the pain any longer. At 300 volts, he screamed, pounded on the wall and complained that his heart was troubling him, which links back to the complaint that he mentioned that we went through in the last slide. At 315 volts, the learner pounded on the wall again and then refused to continue. And from then on, he made no response. And the teacher, which is the real participant, was told that an absence of a response should be treated as a wrong answer. There were various prods that the experimenter used to get the real participant to continue with the experiment. The first prod is simply please continue. Prod 2 is the experiment requires that you continue. And prod 3 says that it is absolutely essential that you continue. Then the last prod is prod 4. You have no other choice, you must continue. And the teacher was told that whilst the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage. Please go on. Obvious ethical issues, psychological and physical harm to participants. All of the participants were deceived and they were not told the aims of the study or what it was about, so they could not give fully informed consent. And they weren't really allowed to withdraw because they were encouraged and pressured to carry on, when an ethical experiment would allow the participants to leave at any moment and be able to withdraw any data that they had already submitted or completed. This did not happen in Milgram's experiment. Then we have the findings. All of the participants went to at least 300 volts. 22.5% stopped at 315 and 65% went all the way to 450 volts. Most participants showed signs of extreme anxiety, such as sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips, groaning and digging their nails into their hands. And 3 had full-blown, uncontrollable seizures. Despite this, 84% of the participants felt glad to have participated, and 74% felt they learned something of personal significance. Prior to the experiment, Milgram had asked 14 psychology students to predict the participants' behaviour, and they thought that no more than 3% would go to 450 volts. A couple of conclusions can be drawn from this study. The first is that it challenges the myth that evil lurks in the minds of evil people. Because remember, these were ordinary people that were brought in. It's not that they had any prior history of aggression or anything like that. They were ordinary people. And so another conclusion is that obedience was due to situational factors. So it wasn't because of their personality, but it's because they were in a situation which meant that they felt more likely to obey the outlandish requests that were made to them by the experimenter. Then we have just some general criticisms, which you do not have to know, but when you're forming your evaluations, using keywords such as validity is a very good way to show the marker that you have an in-depth knowledge. So there is low population validity of this study because all of the participants were from America, and therefore it cannot be generalised to other countries. There is also low internal validity because they could have guessed what was going on, so there might be an element of demand characteristics. There could be some good external validity because the lab environment accurately depicted other authority situations. Real-world applications, situations like what Milgram fragmented doesn't really happen in real life, or they are very rare. And the study was based on the Holocaust, and none of the participants would have experienced something similar to it. So can we really determine that Milgram's conclusions are accurate when it cannot be applied to any other situation that anyone in modern day, or even at the time, most likely would have experienced? Then lastly, we have individual differences. Some of the participants may have been more sensitive to other people's feelings and may have felt worse about hurting someone, making them less likely to obey. And all of them would have been brought up differently and may have traits of an authoritarian personality, which we'll move on to in a different video. As I said before, you do not need to know these criticisms, but they're just good knowledge to be able to integrate them into your answers. Now we are moving on to the evaluations. These are ones that I created. You do not need to know these. There are always going to be many evaluations that you can make for any part of this course, but these are very good. So if you were struggling for ideas, feel free to use these and reword them in a way that works for you. So the first evaluation is a limitation for Milgram's study, is that it has low internal validity, as the participants guessed that real electric shocks weren't being administered. And Perry's research in 2013 confirms this, as many of the participants expressed doubts about the shocks when she listened to Milgram's tapes. However, Sheridan and King in 1972 conducted a similar study where real electric shocks were given to a puppy. Despite the real electric shocks, 54% of the male students and 100% of the females delivered what they thought was a fatal shock. And furthermore, Milgram himself reported that 70% of his participants said they believed the shocks were genuine. So this matters because it shows that not all of the participants thought the experiment was real, but the majority did, suggesting that people do obey authority when told to do things that they wouldn't normally do. A second evaluation is a strength of Milgram's study, is that it has good external validity, even though it was conducted in a lab. However, Milgram argued that this environment accurately reflected wider authority relationships in real life. This is further supported by Hoffling et al. In 1966, who studied nurses on a hospital ward and found that levels of obedience to unjustified demands by doctors were high, with 21 out of 22 complying. This suggests that the processes of obedience to authority that occurred in Milgram's study can be generalised to other situations. This matters because it gives insight into how obedience operates in real life. Then lastly, another limitation is that there is an alternate explanation as to why the participants obeyed, called the social identity theory, which states that obedience lies in group identification. In Milgram's study, participants identified with the experimenter and the science of the study. When obedience levels fell, this was because the participants identified less with the science and more with the victim or with another group. Haslam and Riker in 2012 analysed how each person behaved every time one of the 4 prods was used. The first 3 prods don't demand obedience, they appeal for the help of science. The 4th prod demanded obedience, and every time it was used, the participant quit. This matters because it shows that alternative explanations need to be taken into account when looking at Milgram's study and why they obeyed to gain a full understanding. So that is all of the content that you need to know for Milgram. It may seem like a lot, but form your own resources based off of this PowerPoint and this video and figure out what works best for you. And to help you gain understanding and to gain confidence in your knowledge, I've got an exam question for you, which you can either write out in full or just think about it in your head, but give it a go. So, part A of this question is that Milgram's experiments into obedience can be criticised as being unethical. Describe 2 ethical issues, and that's 4 marks. And then B is choose one of the ethical issues identified in your answer to A and explain a way of dealing with it. So pause the video, take a minute to just reflect, write down your answer if you want to, and then come back for the mark scheme. So for part A, you can have 1 mark for identification of issue and a further mark for elaboration for both of the issues. For example, 1 issue is deception. Milgram deceived participants into believing that they had an equal chance of being a teacher or learner, but in fact it was rigged. So the ethical issue could be for either the participant or the experimenter. And then for B, you can say that a way of dealing with the issue is debriefing the participant if they were deceived. It would have to be explained why it was necessary to deceive them and answer any questions that they might have wanted to ask, as well as reassuring them. If the answer could apply to either ethical issue, it is credit-worthy, and the candidate doesn't need to specify which ethical issue they have chosen to deal with. There are so many ethical issues that you can talk about with Milgram. That's why the mark scheme doesn't go into that much detail, because there are multiple answers that you could give. But if you follow the structure outlined in this mark scheme, then you will get very high marks for questions similar to these. If you have any questions, leave a comment below, see if maybe you could help each other out a bit, and rewatch the video as many times as you need, or come back to it at a later date when you come back to revision for Milgram. And I hope you found this useful, and I will be back soon with another video. Please leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.